The heat rose from the asphalt in waves, bending the light and making the chrome of a dozen motorcycles shimmer like mirages in a desert. Iron Thunder Custom Cycles sat on the edge of Route 87, a sprawling workshop with corrugated metal walls and a reputation that stretched across 3 states. For 22 years, bikers from every corner of the Southwest had brought their machines here, trusting the men in oil-stained shirts to resurrect engines that doctors elsewhere had declared dead. Marcus Gearbox Thompson stood at the entrance, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. At 54, he was the patriarch of this mechanical kingdom, a man whose fingers had touched more carburetors than most people had shaken hands. His arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of Vietnam, of lost brothers, of rides that lasted until the sun forgot to set. Behind him, 4 other mechanics moved through the shop like priests in a cathedral of steel and gasoline. There was Danny Torque Williams, barely 30 but already legendary for rebuilding a 1948 Panhead from nothing but rust and determination. There was old Samuel, who claimed he could hear what was wrong with an engine just by the way it breathed. There was Miguel, who had crossed the border 20 years ago with nothing but a wrench and a dream, and had since become the shop's suspension specialist. And there was Jake, the youngest at 23, still learning but eager, his enthusiasm sometimes outpacing his wisdom. They had seen everything. At least, that's what they believed, until the black pickup truck pulled in, its trailer carrying something that would test every assumption they held dear. The truck door opened, and out stepped a woman who immediately drew every eye in the shop. She was tall, perhaps 5'10", with skin the color of dark mahogany and hair pulled back in tight braids that fell past her shoulders. She wore work boots that had clearly seen actual work, jeans with oil stains that spoke of countless hours under hoods and frames, and a simple gray t-shirt that read Detroit Iron across the front. Her name was Lorraine Mitchell, though everyone who knew her called her Rain. Behind her, an older white man emerged from the passenger side. His name was Walter Hendricks, and the motorcycle on that trailer was his entire world. Gearbox walked out to meet them, squinting against the sun. He noticed the way the woman moved, confident, purposeful, like someone who understood gravity and leverage and the physics of heavy machinery. He noticed, but he didn't process it. His eyes went straight to the bike on the trailer. It was a 1952 Vincent Black Shadow, one of the rarest and most coveted motorcycles ever built. Even under a layer of road dust, it gleamed with the kind of beauty that made men religious. Gearbox felt his heart skip a beat. He had worked on perhaps 3 Vincents in his entire career, and none of them had been a Black Shadow. "Lord have mercy," old Samuel whispered, emerging from the shop. "Is that what I think it is?" Walter Hendricks nodded slowly. He was 73 years old, and the weight of those years showed in his face. His eyes, though, burned with a desperate hope that seemed almost painful to witness. "My father bought this bike in 1953, Walter said, his voice carrying the gravel of a lifetime of cigarettes. "He rode it across this country 4 times before I was born. He taught me to ride on this machine. When he passed in 1987, it became mine. It's been running perfectly for 70 years, until 3 months ago." Gearbox circled the trailer slowly, his practiced eye taking in every detail. The Vincent was in remarkable condition, clearly maintained with religious devotion. The chrome was original, the leather seat showed wear but no neglect, and the paint, while faded in places, told the story of countless journeys without a single mark of abandonment. "What happened 3 months ago?" Gearbox asked. Walter's face darkened. "She just stopped. Middle of nowhere, outside of Amarillo. Engine cut out like someone flipped a switch. Hasn't started since." "You tried turning her over?" "Every day for 3 months. Every mechanic between here and Oklahoma City has taken a look. Nobody can figure it out. They've checked the magneto, the carburetor, the timing, the fuel system, the electrical. Everything tests fine, but she won't fire." Gearbox exchanged a look with his crew. This was the kind of challenge they lived for, the mechanical mystery that separated true craftsmen from parts changers. He felt the familiar surge of competitive pride, the need to solve what others couldn't. "We'll take a look," he said. "Can't promise anything, but if anyone can figure it out, we can." It was then that Rain spoke for the first time. Her voice was clear and measured, carrying an authority that seemed at odds with her relative youth. She looked to be in her mid-30s, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had seen more engines fail and resurrect than most mechanics twice her age. "I've been working on this with Walter for the past 2 weeks," she said. "I've gone through every standard diagnostic. The compression is perfect. The spark is strong. Fuel delivery is clean. This isn't a mechanical failure." Gearbox turned to look at her fully for the first time. His expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible tightening around the eyes that Rain had seen countless times before. It was the look of a man recalculating, adjusting his assumptions, trying to fit a square peg into the round hole of his expectations. "You a mechanic?" he asked. 20 years. Started in my grandmother's garage in Detroit when I was 14. Specialized in vintage British and European machines for the last 12. Danny Torque Williams let out a small laugh that he quickly tried to disguise as a cough. Old Samuel studied the ground. Jake openly stared. Gearbox nodded slowly. "Well, we appreciate you bringing it in. We'll take it from here." The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable. Rain felt it land like a door closing, like a wall being built brick by brick in the space of a single sentence. She had felt this before, in every shop she had ever walked into, in every circle of mechanics who couldn't reconcile her face with their assumptions about who belonged under a hood. Walter Hendricks cleared his throat. "Actually, Marcus, I'd like Rain to stay on this. Work alongside your team. She's been with this bike longer than anyone, and I trust her instincts." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Gearbox's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was not an unkind man, not deliberately prejudiced, but he had spent his entire life in a world with certain unwritten rules, and one of those rules was that his shop was his kingdom. "Mr. Hendricks," he said carefully, "we don't usually let outsiders work in our space. Insurance issues, liability, you understand." "I understand you've got a reputation for being the best," Walter replied, his voice hardening slightly. "I also understand that 6 other shops have told me the exact same thing about their expertise. None of them could solve this. Maybe it's time to try something different." Rain watched the exchange without expression. She had learned long ago that arguing for her own competence rarely worked. The only language that truly spoke in these situations was results. Words were wind. Only the work was real. "I'll make you a deal," she said quietly. "Give me 1 hour with the bike before your team starts. Just 1 hour. If I don't find something worth following up on, I'll step back and let you work without interference." Gearbox studied her face, searching for something he couldn't name. There was no defiance there, no ego, just the calm certainty of someone who knew her own capabilities and felt no need to defend them. 1 hour, he agreed. The Vincent was wheeled into the main bay of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, and for the first time in what felt like years, the shop fell completely silent. Even the radio, which usually played a constant stream of classic rock, seemed to have paused out of respect for what was about to unfold. Rain circled the motorcycle slowly, her eyes moving over every curve and angle with the intensity of a sculptor examining marble. She didn't touch it yet. She just looked. Gearbox and his crew watched from a respectful distance, their skepticism barely concealed beneath thin veneers of professional courtesy. When Rain finally approached the bike, she did something unexpected. Instead of reaching for tools, instead of opening the engine case or testing the electrical system, she simply placed her hand on the fuel tank and closed her eyes. Danny whispered something to Jake that made the younger man smirk. Old Samuel hushed them with a sharp look. Rain stood there for nearly 2 minutes, her palm flat against the warm metal, her breathing slow and even. When she finally opened her eyes, there was something different in them. A focus. A direction. She crouched down beside the engine, her face level with the timing chest cover. Her fingers traced the edges of the metal, feeling for something invisible. Then, without a word, she reached into her tool bag and produced a small dental mirror and a pen light. "What are you looking for?" Gearbox asked, his curiosity finally overwhelming his resistance. "A story," Rain replied simply. She angled the mirror into the narrow space between the engine cases, shining the penlight into darkness that hadn't seen illumination in decades. For several long moments, she moved the mirror fractionally, adjusting angles, searching for something that the others couldn't even imagine. Then she stopped. Her body went very still. "There," she whispered. "There what?" Danny asked, stepping closer despite himself. Rain stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. I need to remove the primary cover, and I'm going to need everyone to step back. Gearbox's protective instincts flared. Now hold on. That's a 70-year-old Vincent. You don't just start pulling covers off without knowing exactly what you're doing. Rain turned to face him, and something in her gaze made him pause. It wasn't anger, wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, something that spoke of 1,000 moments just like this one. 1,000 times she had been doubted. 1,000 times she had proven herself anyway. Mr. Thompson, she said quietly, I rebuilt my first Vincent when I was 19 years old. It was a 1950 Rapide that my grandmother had stored in her garage for 30 years. Everyone told her it was worthless, that it would never run again, that she should sell it for scrap. I spent 2 years bringing it back to life. I learned every millimeter of that engine, every quirk, every secret that Vincent engineers built into these machines. When it finally fired up, my grandmother cried. She had owned it since 1962. Her husband had bought it for her before he shipped out to Vietnam. He never came back. That bike was the last piece of him she had, and I gave it back to her. The shop was utterly silent. I don't need you to believe in me, Rain continued. I just need you to let me work. Gearbox stood very still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded and stepped back. What happened next would become legend in motorcycle circles across the Southwest. Rain removed the primary cover with the precision of a surgeon, her movements efficient and economical. Beneath it, the primary drive looked exactly as it should, the chain properly tensioned, the sprockets showing normal wear for a machine of this age. But Rain wasn't looking at what was supposed to be there. She was looking at what wasn't. She reached into the narrow space at the bottom of the primary case, her fingers probing into a cavity that shouldn't have existed. When she withdrew her hand, she was holding something that made every man in that shop gasp. It was a small leather pouch, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth. The leather was cracked and dry, clearly ancient, and sealed with a wax stamp that had long since degraded. "What in the world?" Walter breathed. Rain held the pouch carefully, as if it might crumble at any moment. "This has been sitting against the oil drain plug since before any of us were born. Over time, the leather expanded from the heat and oil exposure. It's been blocking the drain passage, causing a microscopic pressure buildup in the crankcase. Not enough to damage anything, but just enough to create a vapor lock effect when the engine gets hot. The bike runs fine until it reaches a certain temperature. Then the pressure differential in the crankcase prevents proper fuel mixture, and the engine dies." She paused, looking at the pouch in her hand. No one found it because no one was looking for something that shouldn't exist. They were all chasing the obvious answers. Walter Hendricks walked forward on unsteady legs, his eyes fixed on the leather pouch. His hands were trembling. "That's my father's handwriting," he whispered, pointing to faded marks on the oilcloth. "I'd know it anywhere. He wrote that." The letters were barely visible, but they spelled out 2 words. "For Walter." Walter took the pouch from Rain's hands with the reverence of a man receiving a holy relic. His eyes were filling with tears, but he blinked them back with the fierce pride of a generation taught that men don't cry. "He hid something for me," Walter said, his voice breaking. "In the one place he knew I'd eventually have to look. He knew this bike would outlast him. He knew I'd keep it running. And he knew that someday, someone would find this." He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside the leather pouch were 2 items: a folded photograph, yellowed with age, and a military dog tag. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s, standing beside the very Vincent Black Shadow that now sat in the shop. He was grinning, carefree, immortal in that way that only the young can be. On the back, in that same familiar handwriting, were the words, "First ride home from the dealer, August 12, 1953. The best day of my life until you were born." The dog tag was simpler. Just a name, a service number, and a date. Walter held these treasures against his chest, and the tears finally came. In that moment, something shifted in the air of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles. The men who had spent the last hour silently doubting Rain found themselves looking at her differently. Not with the grudging respect of colleagues forced to acknowledge competence, but with something deeper. She had not just fixed a motorcycle. She had restored a connection between a son and his long-dead father. She had found what no one else could see, not because she was smarter or more skilled, but because she had looked with different eyes. Gearbox cleared his throat, his own emotions threatening to betray him. "Miss Mitchell," he said slowly, "I believe I owe you an apology." Rain shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. The bike owes Walter 70 years of faithful service, and today it gave him one more gift. That's what matters." She turned back to the Vincent and began reassembling the primary cover. Her movements were steady, certain, unhurried. She was in her element, and in that element there was no room for grudges or grievances. There was only the work. Old Samuel was the first to approach, offering his hand. "I've been turning wrenches since before you were born," he said gruffly. "And I ain't never seen anyone read a machine like that. Where'd you learn?" Rain smiled slightly. "My grandmother used to say that every engine has a heartbeat. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Over the next hour, she worked alongside the Iron Thunder crew, and something remarkable began to happen. The walls that had stood between them started to crumble, not dramatically, but slowly, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. Danny asked her about the Detroit motorcycle scene. Miguel inquired about British carburetor specifications. Jake, to everyone's surprise, asked if she would teach him what she knew about reading machines. By the time the sun began its descent toward the Texas horizon, the Vincent was running. Its engine sang with the deep, throaty purr that only a well-tuned Vincent can produce. Walter sat astride the machine, his face transformed by joy, the leather pouch now safely tucked inside his jacket, close to his heart. He rode it in slow circles around the parking lot, tears streaming freely down his weathered face, and no one in that shop pretended not to notice. Before we continue with this story, I want to take a moment. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this, where a single moment of courage and skill can change everything, where the underestimated become the undeniable, these stories deserve to be shared. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single one. The sun had set 3 hours ago, but the lights of Iron Thunder custom cycles still blazed against the Texas darkness. Walter Hendricks had left just before nightfall, the Vincent purring beneath him like a contented beast, finally freed from a cage it hadn't known it was in. His promise to return had been sincere, his handshake with Rain long and emotional. Now, the shop was quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes after revelation, after the world has shifted slightly on its axis, and everyone is still finding their new footing. Rain sat on an overturned milk crate near the main bay door, drinking a bottle of water and watching the stars emerge one by one over the flat Texas landscape. Her muscles ached pleasantly, the way they always did after a good day of work, and her mind was that particular kind of empty that came from complete focus followed by complete release. Gearbox appeared beside her, 2 bottles of cold root beer in his hands. He offered one without speaking, and she accepted it the same way. For a long moment, they just sat there, 2 mechanics sharing the kind of silence that only people who work with their hands truly understand. "My father was a mechanic," Gearbox finally said. "He never owned his own shop, worked for other people his whole life. Good enough to keep any machine running, but never believed he was good enough to run his own place. I opened Iron Thunder because I wanted to prove that a black man could own something in this town. Could be the best at something in this town." Rain turned to look at him, surprised by this revelation. In the fluorescent light of the shop behind them, she could see for the first time the subtle gray in his close-cropped hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of squinting against bright lights and dark problems. "I know what it means to walk into a room and have people's expectations try to push you back out," he continued. "I know what it feels like to have to prove yourself twice as hard just to be seen as half as good. And today, I treated you exactly the way people used to treat me. I'm sorry for that." Rain took a long drink of her root beer before answering. "When I was 22, I applied to work at a restoration shop in Michigan. Classic American muscle cars, beautiful machines. The owner looked at my resume, looked at me, and said, 'Sweetheart, these cars are worth more than your house. Why don't you try the tire shop down the street?' I didn't argue. I just left." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. 6 months later, that shop got in a 1969 Camaro ZL1, one of only 69 ever made. The owner had promised the client he could solve a mysterious electrical issue that 3 other shops had failed to diagnose. He couldn't. The client was going to pull the car and destroy his reputation. He got desperate, called every shop in the state looking for help. Eventually, someone gave him my number. Gearbox raised an eyebrow. And I drove 3 hours to his shop in the middle of the night. Found the problem in 20 minutes. It was a pinched wire in the steering column that only grounded out when the wheel was turned to a specific angle. No one had found it because no one had thought to check there. Did you help him? Rain smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I quoted him my rate. He paid it. Then I left. He never apologized, never acknowledged what had happened before. Some people never do. Gearbox nodded slowly, understanding something that went beyond words. What made you keep going? All those years, all those closed doors? Rain was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he had heard it before. My grandmother, Evelyn Mitchell. She was born in 1932 in a small town in Alabama where a black woman wasn't supposed to touch anything more complicated than a broom. But her father, my great-grandfather, he had a gift. He could fix anything with an engine. Cars, trucks, tractors, anything that moved. He taught her everything he knew in secret after dark, when no one could see a girl learning a man's trade. She leaned back against the corrugated metal wall, her eyes on the stars. When she was 19, she moved to Detroit. Got a job at a factory making parts for the big automakers. Saved every penny. When she was 35, she bought a small garage on the east side of the city. For the next 40 years, that garage was the only place within 50 miles where certain people felt comfortable bringing their cars. Working-class folks who got looked at funny at the big dealerships, women who were tired of being talked down to, anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in the world of engines and grease. Rain turned to look at Gearbox directly. She raised me in that garage, taught me that the only thing that matters is the work. Not what people think of you, not what they expect from you, just the work. The machines don't care what you look like. They only care if you understand them. Inside the shop, the other mechanics had gathered near the door, listening without pretending not to. Old Samuel had his arms crossed over his chest, nodding slowly. Danny was leaning against a workbench, his earlier smirk long gone, replaced by something thoughtful. Miguel was translating quietly for his cousin who had stopped by to help with a late project. Jake was recording everything in his mind, sensing that he was witnessing something important, something that would shape the mechanic he would eventually become. My grandmother passed 3 years ago, Rain continued. Left me that garage, the one I still run back in Detroit. Left me her Vincent, which I still ride every Sunday morning. And she left me her philosophy. She used to say that every locked door is just an invitation to find another way in. That every person who underestimates you is giving you an advantage they don't even know they're giving. She stood up, stretching muscles that had been still too long. I don't need people to believe in me, Mr. Thompson. My grandmother believed in me enough for a lifetime. I just need the chance to do what I know how to do. Today you gave me that chance. That's all I ever ask for. Gearbox stood as well, and something in his posture had changed. He extended his hand, and this time, when Rain shook it, it was different. This wasn't the handshake of strangers being polite. This was the handshake of equals recognizing each other. I'd like to make you an offer, he said. We get bikes in here from all over the Southwest. Some of them are problems we've never seen before, mysteries that my team doesn't have the background to solve. I'd like to put you on retainer. Whenever we hit a wall, we call you. You consult remotely when you can, come down in person when you can't. Whatever your rate is, I'll pay it. Rain considered this for a moment. That's a generous offer. It's a smart offer. I just watched you do something in 1 hour that 6 shops couldn't do in 3 months. I didn't build this business by letting pride get in the way of excellence. Before Rain could respond, the sound of motorcycle engines cut through the night air. Multiple engines, heavy and rumbling, approaching from the direction of the highway. The Iron Thunder crew tensed instinctively. Late-night visitors rarely meant good news. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting harsh white paths through the darkness. They were custom builds, loud and aggressive, and the men who dismounted them moved with the loose confidence of people who expected to be feared. The leader was a large man with a shaved head and arms covered in faded tattoos. His vest bore patches that Gearbox recognized immediately, a club from the next county over, one with a reputation for causing trouble wherever they went. His name was Ricky Vance, and he had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Gearbox," he called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "Working late, old man?" Gearbox stepped forward, positioning himself between the newcomers and his shop. "What do you want, Ricky?" Vance looked around the lot, his eyes sliding over the crew and lingering a moment too long on Rain. His expression shifted into something uglier. "Word travels fast in this business," he said. "Heard you had a Vincent Black Shadow in here today. Heard it was running a secret that somebody finally cracked." He stepped closer, and in the harsh light from the shop, the scars on his knuckles were visible. Old scars, hard-earned, telling stories of violence that he wore like badges of honor. "Walter Hendricks is a friend of our club. Has been for 30 years. We take care of our friends. So when we heard that some nobody was poking around in his family's bike, finding things that should have stayed hidden, we got concerned." Rain felt the tension in the air shift, felt the way the Iron Thunder crew had subtly repositioned themselves, forming a loose barrier between the visitors and the shop. She said nothing, but her mind was working rapidly, assessing the situation, looking for angles. "Whatever was in that bike belongs to Walter," Gearbox said evenly. "He was here when it was found. He took it with him. This isn't your concern." Vance's smile flickered. "See, that's where we disagree. Walter's getting old. His mind ain't what it used to be. Sometimes old men get taken advantage of by people who see opportunity where they should see respect." He was looking directly at Rain now, and there was nothing subtle about the threat in his gaze. "I don't know who you are or where you came from," he said to her, "but you need to understand something about how things work around here. This is our territory. These are our people. And when an outsider shows up and starts stirring things that should stay settled, we take notice." Rain met his gaze without flinching. In her 35 years, she had faced down men who thought their size or their loudness or their capacity for violence made them powerful. She had learned that true power came from a different place entirely. "I'm a mechanic," she said simply. "I was asked to look at a motorcycle. I found a problem and I fixed it. That's all." "That ain't all," Vance growled. "Word is you found something valuable, something that's been hidden in that bike for 70 years. Something that might be worth a lot of money to the right collector." Understanding dawned. This wasn't about protecting Walter Hendricks. This was about greed dressed up in the language of loyalty. These men had heard about the discovery and imagined something valuable, something they could take or extort or leverage for their own benefit. Old Samuel stepped forward, and despite his age, there was nothing frail about his stance. What was found in that bike was personal, family history, nothing more. Vance's eyes narrowed. "And you believe that, old man? You really think someone hid something in a motorcycle for 70 years and it's just, what, a love letter? What I believe is that you're on private property making threats against people who haven't done anything wrong. What I believe is that Walter Hendricks is on his way home right now, happy for the first time in months, and whatever he found belongs to him and him alone. What I believe is that you should get back on your bikes and ride away before this conversation goes somewhere none of us want it to go." The two groups stood facing each other in the parking lot of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, and for a long moment, the only sound was the tick of cooling engines and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the Texas darkness. Vance looked at old Samuel, then at Gearbox, then at the rest of the crew. He was calculating odds, weighing risks and rewards, trying to figure out if this was a fight worth having. Whatever he saw in their faces seemed to give him pause. "This ain't over," he said finally. "We know where this shop is. We know where to find all of you. And we're gonna find out what was really in that bike. Count on it." He signaled to his companions, and they mounted their motorcycles with exaggerated slowness, making sure everyone understood that they were leaving by choice, not necessity. Their engines roared to life, deliberately loud, deliberately threatening, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness of the Texas night. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Danny let out a breath he had apparently been holding for minutes. "Well," he said, "that was fun." The next morning, the sun rose over Ridgemont with the same indifferent beauty it had shown for millennia, unconcerned with the small dramas of human beings and their machines. But in the cramped back office of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, the events of the previous night were very much on everyone's minds. Gearbox had arrived at 5 in the morning, unable to sleep, and had found Rain already there, sitting on the same milk crate, watching the dawn paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. She had checked into a motel on the edge of town the night before, but clearly, sleep had eluded her as well. Now, with the full crew assembled and coffee brewing in the pot that had served this shop for at least 2 decades, they faced the question of what to do next. "Ricky Vance is dangerous," old Samuel said bluntly. "I've known men like him my whole life. They don't make idle threats. If he thinks there's something valuable connected to this situation, he won't stop until he's satisfied his curiosity." "Or until someone stops him," Danny added. "What exactly did he think was in that bike?" Miguel asked. "A photograph and a dog tag aren't worth anything to anyone except Walter." Gearbox shook his head. "Doesn't matter what's really there. Matters what he thinks might be there. The Vincent is famous. The family that owned it had money once, back in the 50s and 60s. Plenty of rumors over the years about hidden valuables, stashed fortunes, that sort of thing. Ricky probably heard about the discovery and let his imagination fill in the rest." Rain had been quiet throughout this discussion, but now she spoke. "What's Walter's situation? Does he have people looking out for him?" "His wife passed 5 years ago. His kids live out of state, come visit maybe twice a year. He's got friends in town, but nobody who could stand up to Vance's crew if they decided to pay him a visit. Then we need to warn him, make sure he understands the potential danger." Gearbox nodded. "I'll call him this morning. But even if he knows, what can he do? He's 73 years old. He can't exactly fight off 3 men half his age." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated this reality. In a perfect world, the law would handle situations like this. But Ridgemont was a small town with a small police force, and Vance's club had a long history of operating just barely within legal boundaries. They never did anything that could be easily prosecuted. They just hovered at the edge of criminality, using intimidation and reputation to get what they wanted. It was Jake who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "We can't just let this happen. Walter trusted us with his father's bike. We found something important for him. That makes him our responsibility now." Danny laughed, but it was the laugh of someone considering a bad idea and finding it strangely appealing. "Kid wants to go to war over a 70-year-old photograph." "It's not about the photograph," Jake said stubbornly. "It's about what's right. Walter came to us for help. We helped him. Now he might be in trouble because of that help. We can't just walk away." Rain looked at the young mechanic with new respect. In her experience, men who talked about doing what was right often changed their minds when the doing became difficult. But there was something in Jake's eyes that suggested he might be different. "The kid's right," she said quietly. "But we need to be smart about this. Vance isn't going to be intimidated by a bunch of mechanics standing around looking tough. He's got numbers, he's got a reputation, and he's got nothing to lose. If we're going to protect Walter, we need to change the equation." "How?" Gearbox asked. "By taking away his leverage. He thinks there's something valuable. He thinks he can get it through intimidation. We need to make sure everyone in town knows the truth about what was found. A photograph and a dog tag, family memories. Nothing worth stealing, nothing worth fighting over. Once that information is public, Vance loses his reason to pursue this." Old Samuel stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Word travels fast in Ridgemont. If we tell the right people, the whole town will know by sundown." "And if Vance still comes after Walter?" Danny asked. Rain's expression hardened. "Then we make sure Walter isn't alone. We take shifts. We keep eyes on his house. We let Vance know that if he wants to threaten an old man, he's going to have to go through all of us to do it." It was a simple plan, almost naive in its directness. But sometimes the simplest plans were the best ones. Evil thrived in shadows, in isolation, in the silence of people who saw wrong and said nothing. Drag it into the light, surround it with witnesses, and it often withered. The crew split up to begin implementing the plan. Miguel and Danny went to the local diner, where gossip spread faster than breakfast orders. Old Samuel headed to the VFW hall, where veterans gathered to remember wars and share stories. Jake took to social media, posting about the beautiful reunion between a son and his father's memory, complete with Walter's permission and a carefully framed photograph. Gearbox called Walter directly, explaining the situation with the blunt honesty that their friendship deserved. To his relief, Walter was not frightened. If anything, he sounded almost amused. "Ricky Vance has been sniffing around my family for 30 years, Walter said. "Ever since my brother made the mistake of doing business with his father back in the 80s. They've always thought we had money hidden somewhere. Let them think what they want. I've got nothing worth stealing and nothing worth dying for except memories. And those can't be taken, only shared." Rain, meanwhile, had a different task. She returned to the Vincent, which Walter had left at the shop overnight for a final inspection, and began a thorough examination. Not of the engine or the frame, but of the history. She photographed every inch of the machine, documenting its serial numbers, its unique modifications, its story. If Vance tried to claim any ownership or connection to the bike, she wanted to have irrefutable proof of its true provenance. As she worked, her mind kept returning to her grandmother's garage in Detroit. Evelyn Mitchell had faced down her share of predators over the years, men who thought a woman alone was an easy target, men who saw her success as an affront to their understanding of the world. She had never backed down, never compromised, never let fear make her decisions. "The moment you let them see you flinch," she used to say, "you've already lost half the battle. Stand firm, speak truth, and let them break themselves against your certainty." By noon, the story had spread through Ridgemont like wildfire. The tale of the Vincent Black Shadow and its hidden message from beyond the grave had captured the town's imagination. People who had never cared about motorcycles suddenly found themselves emotionally invested in Walter Hendricks and his father's final gift. The diner was buzzing. The barbershop couldn't stop talking about it. Even the local news station sent a reporter to interview Walter at his home. When the story aired that evening, it included footage of the photograph and the dog tag, displayed with Walter's tearful blessing. It included interviews with townspeople talking about the importance of family and memory. It included a brief mention of Ricky Vance's club and their apparent interest in the discovery, framed carefully as concerns from local community members. That last detail was deliberate. By mentioning Vance publicly, even obliquely, the news story had put a spotlight on his actions. If anything happened to Walter now, if there was any hint of intimidation or violence, everyone would know who to suspect. It was a shield made of light and attention, and it worked exactly as intended. That night, Ricky Vance and his crew drove through Ridgemont but did not stop. They circled Walter's block twice, saw the cars parked outside, saw the lights on in several neighboring houses where people had gathered to keep watch, and kept driving. They passed Iron Thunder custom cycles, saw Gearbox standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and did not slow down. The message was clear. Walter Hendricks was not alone. The town was watching. Whatever Vance had hoped to accomplish, the cost had just become too high. But Rain knew better than to celebrate. Men like Vance didn't give up easily. They just got patient. They waited for attention to fade, for vigilance to relax, for the opportunity that always came to those who watched and waited. The real test was still coming. In the days that followed, Rain found herself spending more and more time at Iron Thunder custom cycles. What had begun as a simple consultation had transformed into something else entirely. She worked alongside the crew on whatever projects came through the door, sharing techniques she had learned in Detroit, absorbing the different approaches that came from working in the Texas heat instead of Michigan winters. The crew, in turn, began to open up to her in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Danny showed her his prized 1965 Triumph Bonneville and asked for her advice on a persistent oil leak. Old Samuel shared stories about the bikes he had ridden across Vietnam, machines that had literally saved his life. Miguel taught her phrases in Spanish that she probably shouldn't repeat in polite company. Jake followed her around like a devoted apprentice, soaking up every word, every technique, every piece of wisdom she was willing to share. And Gearbox watched it all with a strange mixture of pride and wonder. He had built Iron Thunder from nothing, had created a family out of misfits and outcasts, and men who loved machines more than they loved almost anything else. Now that family was growing, changing, becoming something he hadn't anticipated, but couldn't help but welcome. One evening, about a week after the confrontation with Vance, Rain was working late on a complicated carburetor rebuild when she became aware of a presence beside her. She looked up to find Jake standing there with an expression that was part nervous, part determined. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. Rain set down her tools and gave him her full attention. "Go ahead." When you first walked into this shop, everybody looked at you like you didn't belong. I know I did, and I'm sorry for that. But what I want to know is, how do you handle it? How do you walk into a room knowing that people are already counting you out and still have the confidence to do what you do? It was the kind of question that deserved a thoughtful answer. Rain considered it for a moment before responding. When I was about your age, I entered a restoration competition in Dearborn. Classic cars, national judges, big prize money. I was the only woman competing. The only person under 30. And definitely the only one whose entry was a 1967 Shelby GT500 that I had built from a rusted shell in my grandmother's garage. She smiled at the memory. The other competitors laughed at me during the setup phase, made jokes I was supposed to pretend not to hear. When the judging started, most of them didn't even bother to watch my presentation. They had already decided I wasn't worth their attention. What happened? I won. First place. Unanimous decision. And here's the thing, Jake. That trophy sitting in my grandmother's garage doesn't mean anything by itself. It's just metal and wood. What matters is what it represents. Not that I was better than everyone else that day, but that I refused to let their expectations limit my possibilities. Every time someone looks at you and sees something less than what you are, they're giving you an opportunity. They're underestimating you. An underestimation is a gift if you know how to use it. Jake nodded slowly, processing this. Now let me ask you something, Rain continued. Why does it matter to you? What people think, I mean? The young man was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. Because I grew up being told I wasn't going to amount to anything. My dad left when I was 6. My mom worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. Teachers looked at where I came from and treated me like a future statistic. The only reason I'm standing here is because Gearbox saw something in me that nobody else did. He gave me a chance when everyone else had written me off. Rain felt something shift in her chest. This young man, with his eager eyes and oil-stained hands, wasn't so different from the girl she had been 20 years ago. They were both products of doubt and dismissal, both fighting to prove that they were more than what the world had decided they could be. Then you already know the answer to your own question, she said gently. You handle it by proving them wrong. Not with words, not with arguments, but with work, with results, with excellence that can't be denied. She put a hand on his shoulder. You're going to face people who doubt you your whole life, Jake. People who look at you and see your circumstances instead of your potential. But here's the secret. Their doubt is their problem, not yours. Your only job is to be so good at what you do that their opinions become irrelevant. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Both of them turned to see a vehicle pulling into the parking lot, but this time, there was no tension in the air. It was a familiar truck, one they had both seen before. Walter Hendricks stepped out of his pickup, moving with more energy than he had shown in months. The lines in his face were still there, but they seemed softer somehow, less carved by sorrow and more shaped by peace. Hope I'm not interrupting, he called out. Rain walked out to meet him. Never. What brings you by? Walter reached into his truck and pulled out a wooden frame, carefully wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a professionally mounted display. The photograph of his father beside the Vincent, the dog tag, and a small brass plaque that read, Arthur Hendricks, 1929-1987. The ride that brought us together. I wanted you to see this, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted you to know what you gave me. Not just the picture or the tag, but the closure. For 37 years, I've been trying to understand my father, trying to figure out who he really was beneath all the silence and the stoicism. This single photograph tells me more about him than all the words he ever spoke. He paused, looking at the image of that young man grinning beside his motorcycle. He was happy. In that moment, he was purely, completely happy. And he wanted me to know it. He wanted me to know that of all the days of his life, the day that started his journey with this motorcycle was the best until I came along. He loved that bike, yes, but he loved me more. He just never knew how to say it. Rain felt her own eyes growing wet. That's a beautiful way to remember him. It's thanks to you. Thanks to all of you. Walter looked past her to where the rest of the crew had emerged from the shop, drawn by curiosity and the sound of his voice. I've been thinking about what happened, about Vance and his crew. about the way you all stood up for me. I've spent most of my life thinking I had to handle everything alone. My father was like that. His father before him. Men of their generation didn't ask for help. They suffered in silence and called it strength. He shook his head. But you showed me something different. You showed me that there's no weakness in accepting help from good people. That community isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of belonging. And I want to belong somewhere again. I want to be part of something that matters. Gearbox stepped forward, and his face held an expression that the crew rarely saw: open, vulnerable, moved. You've always been part of this community, Walter. You just forgot for a while. We all do sometimes. But we're here. We're always here. The moment hung in the air, heavy with meaning and possibility. Then old Samuel, never one for extended sentimentality, cleared his throat loudly. This is all very touching, he grumbled. But someone told me there was going to be brisket at the VFW tonight, and if we stand around crying much longer, Big Mike is going to eat it all before we get there. The tension broke into laughter, and just like that, the moment transformed from something solemn into something joyful. Plans were made, rides were arranged, and the group prepared to continue their evening at the local Veterans Hall, where the brisket was indeed legendary, and the company was always warm. As Rain walked toward her car, she felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Walter looking at her with an intensity that made her pause. "I want to say something to you specifically," he said quietly. "Something I should have said the day we met." She waited. "My father, for all his silences and his distances, taught me one thing clearly. He taught me that people should be judged by what they can do, not by what others think they should be able to do. He learned that lesson in the war, serving beside men of every background, every color, every walk of life. He said the bullets didn't care about any of that, and neither should we." Walter's eyes met hers, and there was no wavering in his gaze. "I've seen how some people in this town look at you. I've seen the way they try to put you in a box smaller than you deserve. I want you to know that those people are wrong. What you did for me, for my family's memory, that was a gift that transcends anything as small as prejudice. You saw what no one else could see. You gave me back my father, and I will never forget that as long as I live." Rain didn't trust herself to speak. She simply nodded, accepting this benediction with the grace it was offered. Later that night at the VFW hall, surrounded by veterans and mechanics and townspeople who had come together in an unexpected alliance, Rain found herself thinking about the strange paths that life could take. She had come to Texas expecting nothing more than a challenging repair job. Instead, she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not just professional respect, though that was there. Not just friendship, though that was forming. But a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since her grandmother passed. A feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. As she watched the people around her, laughing, arguing, sharing stories and food and the simple joy of human connection, she felt something deep inside her begin to heal. The wounds left by every dismissal, every doubt, every closed door, they didn't disappear. They never would. But they began to feel less like scars and more like medals, evidence of battles fought and survived. If this story is touching something in your heart, I want you to do something right now. Leave a comment saying, "I stand with Walter." That's it. Just those 4 words. Let me know that you believe in the power of community, in the strength of people standing together against those who would tear them apart. Because that's what this story is really about. Not motorcycles, not mysteries, but the unbreakable bond of human beings who refuse to let each other face the darkness alone. Comment, "I stand with Walter, so I can see who you are." 3 weeks passed, and the rhythm of life in Ridgemont settled into something new. The threat from Ricky Vance seemed to have faded, or at least retreated to a distance that allowed normal life to resume. The local news had moved on to other stories. The surveillance of Walter's house had been relaxed as days went by without incident. Even the gossip at the diner had shifted to fresher scandals and more immediate concerns. But Rain remained cautious. In her experience, silence from predators was never a sign of surrender. It was merely a sign of patience. She had extended her stay in Ridgemont indefinitely, renting a small apartment above a hardware store on Main Street. Her shop in Detroit was being managed by her assistant, a capable young woman named Destiny who had been with her for 5 years. The arrangement allowed Rain to focus fully on whatever was happening here, though she couldn't quite articulate what that was. On the surface, she was consulting for Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, helping them expand their expertise in vintage European motorcycles. The work was satisfying, the compensation was fair, and the camaraderie with the crew had grown into something that resembled genuine family. But beneath the surface, something else was brewing. Something that had to do with the way Gearbox looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Something that had to do with the way her heart lifted every time she walked through the doors of the shop. Something that had to do with words not yet spoken and feelings not yet acknowledged. One Tuesday morning, Rain arrived at the shop to find an unexpected visitor. A woman in her mid-50s, elegantly dressed in a way that seemed out of place in the dusty parking lot of a motorcycle repair shop, was standing beside a trailer that held what appeared to be another vintage motorcycle. The woman turned at the sound of Rain's approach, and her face lit up with recognition. "You're her," she said breathlessly. "You're Lorraine Mitchell. I've been trying to find you for 2 weeks." Rain studied the woman, finding nothing threatening in her demeanor but plenty of mystery. "I am. And you are?" "Margaret Chen. My husband is Dr. Philip Chen, head of cardiovascular surgery at Houston Methodist. We saw the news story about what you did for Walter Hendricks, about how you found that hidden message in his father's motorcycle. And we hope, that you might be able to help us with something similar." She gestured toward the trailer, and Rain walked over to see what it held. Under a protective cover, she found a 1939 BMW R71, a rare German motorcycle that had been produced for only 2 years before the war changed everything. Even at a glance, she could see that it was in remarkable condition, clearly maintained with obsessive care. "This motorcycle belonged to my husband's grandfather," Margaret explained. "He was a surgeon in Shanghai before the war, one of the first Chinese doctors to study Western medicine and bring it back to his homeland. In 1939, he purchased this motorcycle from a German diplomat who was leaving the country ahead of the coming storm. He rode it through the war, through the revolution, through everything. When Philip's father immigrated to America in 1962, he brought the motorcycle with him. It's been in our family for 86 years. Rain circled the trailer slowly, her expert eye taking in the details. The BMW R71 was a legendary machine, designed by German engineers who believed that form should follow function, but beauty should follow both. The boxer engine, the pressed steel frame, the iconic styling that would influence motorcycle design for decades to come, all of it was present and preserved. "What's the problem?" she asked. Margaret's expression grew complicated. "Philip's father passed away last month. In his will, he left the motorcycle to Philip with a note that said, 'The answer has always been closer than you thought.' Philip has been obsessing over those words ever since. He believes his father hid something in the motorcycle, just like Walter Hendricks' father did. Something that will explain mysteries that have haunted our family for generations." "What kind of mysteries?" "Philip's grandfather died in 1949, during the communist takeover of Shanghai. The family was forced to flee with almost nothing. They lost everything, their home, their possessions, their history. Philip's father always believed that his father had managed to save something precious before he died, something he had hidden away for future generations to find. He spent his whole life looking for it, and now he's passed that quest on to his son." Rain considered this carefully. The situation was different from Walter's in important ways. The Vincent had been in continuous operation, its problem revealing itself through mechanical failure. This BMW might have been sitting for months or years, its secrets undisturbed and possibly undetectable. "I can't promise anything," she said, "but I'm willing to take a look." The motorcycle was transferred to the main bay of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, where it drew immediate attention from the crew. Old Samuel had served in Korea and had stories about captured German equipment. Danny recognized the engineering lineage that led from this BMW to his own triumph. Miguel admired the metalwork, which had held up remarkably well over nearly 9 decades. But it was Jake who made an observation that stopped everyone cold. "The gas tank," he said slowly. "It's not original." Rain looked at him sharply. "How can you tell?" "The serial numbers. I've been reading about German military manufacturing since I started here. The BMW R71 had a specific stamping pattern on all major components, including the fuel tank. This tank has the right shape, the right styling, But the stamp is wrong. It's a replacement. He pointed to a small marking near the filler cap, barely visible under decades of paint. See that? That's a post-war German manufacturing mark. This tank was made after 1945, probably in the early 50s. Margaret, who had been watching anxiously from the sidelines, gasped. But that's impossible. Philip's father told us the motorcycle was completely original. He was obsessive about authenticity. Rain's mind was racing. If the tank was a replacement, there had to be a reason. Either the original had been damaged and needed replacement, which seemed unlikely given the pristine condition of everything else, or the original had been removed deliberately. Where would the original tank be? She asked Margaret. I have no idea. Philip might know. Should I call him? Please do. The phone call that followed was lengthy and emotional. Dr. Philip Chen, speaking from his office at Houston Methodist, was initially skeptical but grew increasingly agitated as his wife relayed Jake's observation. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, he remembered something. There's a storage unit, he said through the phone's speaker. My father rented it in 1975 and never let anyone else have the key. When he died, we found the key in his personal effects but never got around to opening the unit. We assumed it was just old furniture and paperwork. Where is it? Dr. Chen gave them the address. It was in Houston, less than 4 hours away. Rain looked at the crew, then at Margaret, then at the motorcycle that had carried so many secrets across so many years. Road trip, she said. The Iron Thunder crew mobilized with the efficiency of men who had been riding together for years. Gearbox insisted on coming, as did Jake, who had earned this journey through his sharp observation. Old Samuel claimed his presence was necessary because someone had to keep the young ones from doing anything stupid. Danny volunteered to stay behind and watch the shop, though he made them promise to call with updates. They loaded up in 2 vehicles, Gearbox's truck and Rain's rental, and hit the road for Houston with the kind of determined optimism that only a genuine mystery could inspire. The storage unit was located in a nondescript facility on the outskirts of the city, one of thousands of identical units where people stored the debris of their lives and often forgot about it for decades. The key that Dr. Chen had given his wife fit perfectly, and the lock opened with a click that seemed to echo with decades of anticipation. Inside, the unit was smaller than expected, perhaps 10 by 12 feet. It contained exactly 3 items: a wooden crate, a filing cabinet, and a motorcycle gas tank, wrapped in oiled cloth and resting on a shelf like a sacred relic. Margaret picked up the tank with trembling hands. It was the original, there was no doubt. The markings matched, the patina was consistent with age, and it had clearly been removed and stored with great care. But it was what was inside the tank that changed everything. Rain noticed it first, a slight weight imbalance when Margaret shifted the tank. She took it gently from the woman's hands and tilted it, hearing something solid move within. There was no liquid, just the sound of something metal sliding against the tank's interior walls. There's something inside, she said quietly. Old Samuel produced a flashlight and shone it into the tank's filler opening. What they saw made all of them draw sharp breaths simultaneously. Inside the gas tank, suspended in a cradle of wire mesh that had protected it from damage, was a small metal box. And etched into the top of that box, in Chinese characters that none of them could read, but all of them could feel the weight of, was a single word. Margaret began to cry. That's my husband's grandfather's name, she whispered. Chen, the character for his family name. The extraction of the box required careful work. Rain used tools from her kit to remove a small access panel at the bottom of the tank, a panel that had clearly been modified decades ago to allow exactly this kind of retrieval. The wire mesh had held the box securely for over 70 years, protecting it from the vibrations and movements that could have damaged its contents. When the box was finally free, Margaret held it in her hands as if it might dissolve at any moment. It was heavy, heavier than its size suggested, and sealed with a mechanism that appeared to be more decorative than functional. Should we open it here? Jake asked. Margaret shook her head. Philip needs to be present. This was meant for him, for our family. They agreed to transport everything back to Ridgemont where Dr. Chen could join them. The filing cabinet proved to contain decades of documentation, letters, photographs, and records that told the story of a family's journey from Shanghai to America. The wooden crate held books, mostly medical texts in Chinese, and several journals bound in leather that had survived the decades remarkably well. But the box remained closed, waiting for the man for whom it had been preserved. The drive back to Ridgemont was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Rain found herself thinking about the nature of inheritance, about the things that parents passed to children, and the things that remained hidden until the time was right. Her grandmother had left her a garage, a motorcycle, and a philosophy. Those were her inheritance, her connection to a woman who had shaped everything she had become. What might Dr. Philip Chen's grandfather have left for him? What secret had been worth protecting for 86 years? The questions would have to wait for answers. But the mystery, like all true mysteries, had only deepened. Dr. Philip Chen arrived in Ridgemont 2 days later, driving alone in a luxury sedan that looked painfully out of place on the dusty main street. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and hands that moved with the controlled precision of someone who regularly held human hearts in his palms. His face, when he saw the motorcycle and the gathered crew of mechanics who had helped unravel his family's mystery, showed the kind of emotion that successful surgeons rarely allowed themselves to display. "I've spent my entire career saving lives," he said quietly, standing before the original fuel tank that his grandfather had modified so many decades ago. "But I've never understood why saving lives was so important to my grandfather that he would risk everything, sacrifice everything to become a doctor. Now I think I might finally learn." The box was opened in the back office of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles, with Rain, Gearbox, Old Samuel, Jake, Margaret, and Dr. Chen forming a semicircle around the small metal container. The seal gave way easily, its mechanism long since weakened by age, and when the lid was lifted, a collective gasp filled the room. Inside the box were 3 items: a photograph, a letter, and a ring. The photograph showed a young Chinese man in Western medical attire standing beside a bed where a white woman lay holding a newborn baby. The man was clearly Dr. Chen's grandfather, younger than any of them had imagined, his face a mixture of exhaustion and profound joy. The letter was written in English, in careful script that spoke of education and formality. Dr. Chen read it aloud, his surgeon's voice steady, despite the tears that ran freely down his cheeks. "To my descendants, I write this in the spring of 1949, knowing that the world I have built is about to be destroyed. The revolution will take everything: my hospital, my home, my position in society. But it cannot take what matters most. The woman in this photograph is Helen Morrow. She was an American missionary who came to Shanghai in 1938 to help with the refugee crisis. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her, and she, against all reason and propriety, fell in love with me. We married in secret in 1940, knowing that our union would be accepted by neither her people nor mine. When our son was born in 1941, we named him after both our fathers, James Chen Morrow. Helen died in 1943, a victim of disease that I could not cure despite all my training. Our son was 2 years old. I raised him as my own, hiding his mixed heritage to protect him from a world that would not understand. The ring in this box was Helen's wedding ring. I could not bear to part with it, but neither could I risk it being found. So I hid it here, in the machine that would carry my son to safety when the time came. James, if you are reading this, know that you were born of the deepest love I have ever known. Your mother was the bravest woman I ever met, and you carry her courage in your blood. The world may try to make you choose between your heritages, but you do not have to choose. You are both. You are the best of both. To whoever finds this after James is gone, please tell my family this. I did not become a doctor because I wanted to save lives. I became a doctor because I wanted to save one life in particular, and I failed. But that failure taught me that every life is someone's Helen. Every patient is someone's greatest love. That is why we save them. That is why we must never stop trying. With all my heart, Chen Wei-lin, Shanghai, 1949. The room was utterly silent when Dr. Chen finished reading. The weight of 86 years of secrets hung in the air like incense smoke, sacred and irreversible. Dr. Chen picked up the ring and turned it in his fingers. It was a simple band, gold worn thin by years of being worn, with a tiny inscription on the inside that he had to squint to read. "Forever, wherever," he whispered. "That's what it says. Forever, Wherever. He looked up at the assembled group, these strangers who had become witnesses to his family's most intimate history. My father always told me I had my grandmother's eyes, he said. I never understood what he meant. My grandmother was Chinese, or so I thought. But he wasn't talking about Chen Wei-lin's mother. He was talking about Helen. Helen Morrow, the American missionary who loved a Chinese doctor enough to defy everything she had been taught. He turned to look at Rain, and in his gaze she saw recognition of something profound. You understood, didn't you? When you first saw the tank, when you noticed it wasn't original, you knew there was more to this story than just a mechanical mystery. Rain shook her head. I suspected, but I couldn't have imagined this. My grandfather spent his entire life helping people who were different from him. Chinese patients, Western patients, rich and poor, educated and illiterate. I always thought it was just his nature, his philosophy of medicine. But now I understand. He was honoring Helen. He was living the values she believed in, the values that brought her to Shanghai in the first place. She came to help people who were nothing like her because she believed that human beings were all one family. And he carried that belief forward every day he practiced medicine. Dr. Chen carefully replaced the items in the box and closed the lid. I am the head of the largest cardiovascular surgery program in Texas, he said. I have saved thousands of lives. I have trained dozens of surgeons who will go on to save thousands more. And until this moment, I never truly understood why I do what I do. He looked at Rain. You gave this to me. Not just the box, not just the letter, but the understanding. The why. How can I ever repay that? Rain thought about this question as she had thought about so many things since coming to Ridgemont. The answer, when it came, was simple. Pass it on, she said. Tell someone else's story. Find someone else's hidden truth. The world is full of secrets that need to be uncovered, not for profit or fame, but because the uncovering itself is an act of love. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, accepting this charge with the solemnity it deserved. The day that followed was one of celebration and contemplation. Dr. Chen and Margaret stayed in Ridgemont overnight, sharing dinner with the Iron Thunder crew and trading stories that ranged from hilarious to heartbreaking. Dr. Chen told tales of surgeries that defied odds and patients who exceeded expectations. Old Samuel shared memories of Korea that he had never spoken aloud before. Jake talked about his dreams of one day opening his own shop. And Rain, for the first time and longer than she could remember, allowed herself to be fully present in a moment of joy. As the evening wound down and guests began making their way to beds and hotels, Gearbox found Rain standing alone on the porch of his house, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright against the Texas sky. You're thinking about leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Rain was quiet for a long moment. I have a shop in Detroit. Customers, responsibilities. I can't stay here forever. No, Gearbox agreed, but you could stay for a while longer. There are still mysteries to solve here. Still stories to uncover. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not touching. I'm not good at this, he admitted. Talking about feelings, expressing what's inside. But I know what I see when I look at you, Lorraine Mitchell. I see someone who has spent her whole life proving herself to people who didn't deserve the proof. I see someone who has given and given and given without ever asking for anything in return. And I see someone who might, just might, be willing to let herself be seen, really seen, by someone who has nothing but admiration for everything she is. Rain felt her throat tighten. Marcus, you don't have to say anything, he continued. You don't have to decide anything tonight or tomorrow or next week. I just want you to know that there's a place for you here. Not just in my shop, but in my life, if you want it. When you're ready. He turned and walked back inside, leaving her alone with the stars and the weight of possibility. Rain stood there for a long time, thinking about closed doors and open ones, about expectations and their defiance, about a grandmother who had taught her that the only thing that matters is the work, and about a man who seemed to understand that the work was just the beginning. She was still standing there when the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and she was still there when she finally allowed herself to smile. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, the parking lot of Iron Thunder Custom Cycles was filled with motorcycles of every description. There were Harleys and Triumphs, BMWs and Vincents, Indians and Nortons, vintage machines and modern classics, all gathered in a display of mechanical diversity that would have made any enthusiast weep with joy. The occasion was the grand reopening of the shop, now officially renamed Iron Thunder and Mitchell Custom Cycles, reflecting a partnership that had grown from professional respect into something far deeper. Rain had not returned to Detroit permanently. Instead, she had arranged for Destiny to take over the full operation of the Detroit shop, with Rain serving as a remote consultant for complicated projects. The arrangement allowed her to build a new chapter of her life in Ridgemont, one that included not just her work, but the community she had unexpectedly joined. Walter Hendricks was there, of course, astride his Vincent Black Shadow, which now ran better than it had in decades. Beside him rode his daughter, who had flown in from California for the occasion, and who was already planning to visit more often now that her father had something to show her besides loneliness. Dr. Philip Chen was there with Margaret, representing the hospital's new scholarship program for minority students interested in medicine, a program that Dr. Chen had established in honor of his grandfather and the woman who had loved him across all boundaries. Ricky Vance and his crew were not there. After the news coverage and the public attention, their interest in Walter Hendricks had evaporated. Rumor had it that Vance had moved his operations to another county, seeking easier targets than a community that had learned to stand together. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was brief and unpretentious, exactly as Rain and Gearbox had wanted it. They stood together on the porch of the shop, surrounded by friends and customers and fellow mechanics who had come from across the state to celebrate this moment. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Rain said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But more than that, I want to thank you for everything that led to this day. Every door that was closed in my face made me stronger. Every person who doubted me made me more determined. And every moment of kindness, every hand extended in genuine welcome, reminded me why we do this work in the first place." She looked at Gearbox, who was trying very hard not to cry and failing beautifully. "We don't just fix motorcycles here. We fix connections. Between people and their machines, yes, but also between people and their pasts, between people and their hopes, between people and each other. That's what the work is really about. It's never been about the engines. It's always been about the stories." The crowd applauded, and Rain felt something she had never expected to feel, the sensation of being exactly where she belonged. After the ceremony, after the tours of the expanded shop, and the demonstrations of new equipment, and the endless conversations with fellow enthusiasts, Rain found a quiet moment alone with Jake. The young man had grown tremendously in the past 6 months. He had become the shop's specialist in diagnostic mysteries, using the observational skills that Rain had helped him develop to find problems that others missed. He had also started teaching a Saturday morning class for local teenagers interested in mechanics, passing on the knowledge that had been passed to him. "I have something for you," Rain said, pulling a small box from her pocket. Jake opened it to find a miniature wrench, cast in silver, hanging on a simple chain. "My grandmother gave this to me when I finished my first complete restoration," Rain explained. "She told me it was a reminder that the smallest tool in the right hands can open the biggest possibilities. I want you to have it now." Jake looked at the pendant, then at Rain, and for a moment, his young face showed all the emotions he was still learning to express. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll pass it on someday. When you find someone who needs to believe in themselves as much as you once did." He nodded solemnly, fastening the chain around his neck. "I promise." The day wound down into evening, and the crowd gradually dispersed until only the core group remained. Rain, Gearbox, Old Samuel, Danny, Miguel, and Jake, sitting on the porch of the shop they had built together, watching the sun set over the Texas plain. "You know," Old Samuel said, breaking a comfortable silence, "I've been turning wrenches for 53 years. Seen a lot of changes, a lot of people come and go. But I've never seen anything quite like what's happened here. Never seen a bunch of stubborn old fools learn so much so fast." Danny laughed. "Speak for yourself, old man. I've always been progressive." "You thought women couldn't use an impact wrench until 6 months ago," Miguel pointed out. "I was wrong about that. I can admit when I'm wrong." "First time for everything," Jake muttered, earning a playful cuff on the shoulder from his mentor. Rain listened to their bickering with deep contentment. These men, who had initially looked at her with skepticism and doubt, had become her brothers, not through blood, but through something stronger. Shared work, shared struggle, shared triumph. Gearbox reached over and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, made complicated by all the history that lay behind it. She let him hold it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength that had been earned through decades of labor, the gentleness that he reserved for the things he truly valued. Any regrets? He asked quietly. Rain thought about Detroit, about her grandmother's garage, about the life she had built before this unexpected detour. She thought about the doors that had been closed and the doors that had opened. She thought about prejudice and persistence, about doubt and determination, about the secret that had been hidden in a motorcycle for 70 years, and the truth that had emerged when someone finally looked with open eyes. Not one, she said. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and somewhere else, a motorcycle engine fired up and roared into the gathering darkness. Another journey beginning. Another story waiting to be told. If you watched this far, it's because you really connected with this story. It means you believe in the power of persistence, in the strength of community, in the truth that what we look like is never as important as what we can do. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you, so I can see who really appreciates these stories of courage and determination. Your comment isn't just words on a screen. It's a sign that you're part of this community, part of this family of people who believe that everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves, and while you're at it, hit that like button. Let the algorithm know that stories like this matter, that people want to see content about human beings lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they're facing doubt right now. Maybe they're dealing with people who don't believe in them. Maybe they just need to be reminded that there are places in this world where skill is what counts, not skin color, not gender, not where you came from or who your parents were. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories here, true stories and inspired stories, about people who refuse to be limited by other people's expectations. Stories about the secrets hidden in old motorcycles and the truths revealed when someone takes the time to really look. This is the beginning of something beautiful. Be part of it. Check if you are subscribed, hit the bell for notifications, and come back soon for another story that will remind you why human beings, despite all our flaws and failures, are still capable of extraordinary things. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing. And remember, the smallest person can have the biggest impact if they refuse to let the world make them small. Until next time.